There was a moment on a Tuesday morning in January 2011 when the most expensive television set in America went completely silent. Not because of a writer's strike. Not because of low ratings. Not because the network pulled the plug. The silence came from one man, a man who was earning nearly $2 million per episode, who had spent 8 years turning a mediocre sitcom premise into a cultural phenomenon, and who had just decided, in the middle of what should have been the peak of his career, to set the whole thing on fire. What followed over the next 6 weeks was the most publicly documented self-destruction in the history of Hollywood. And at the center of it all was a single scene, not one that aired on television, but one that played out in real time, on radio, on social media, in hotel rooms and hospital wards, a scene that made it impossible for 2.5 men to ever be the same show again. To understand why it mattered so much, you have to go back to what the show actually was before everything collapsed. 2.5 Men debuted in September 2003 with almost no expectation of survival. Critics dismissed it as lowbrow. The premise was thin. A divorced chiropractor moves in with his hard-drinking, womanizing brother after his wife kicks him out, and the two of them raise his awkward preteen son together. Nothing about that description suggests a show that would eventually average 16.5 million viewers per episode, dominate Monday night television for a decade, and turn its lead actor into the single highest-paid performer on American network TV. But something clicked. Charlie Sheen, playing a character named after himself, was doing something that most television actors never manage. He was making Vice look genuinely comfortable. Charlie Harper didn't suffer for his lifestyle. He didn't get punished for sleeping around or drinking too much or spending money on things that served no purpose other than his own entertainment. He just lived, without apology, and audiences who were exhausted by consequence-driven storytelling found that deeply, almost embarrassingly appealing. By the 2008 to 2009 season, the show was pulling over 15 million viewers per episode. Charlie Sheen's face was on billboards across the country. His bowling shirts had caused a 37% spike in retail sales of the same style. A fictional chiropractor named Alan Harper had somehow inspired a 22% jump in chiropractic school applications. The show had reached that rare level of cultural saturation where the characters felt more real than most real people. And Sheen knew it. When his contract came up for renewal, he asked for $2 million per episode. The number was meant to shock, and it did. Warner Brothers and CBS countered with $1 million, itself an almost absurd figure by any normal standard of television compensation. Sheen said no. Negotiations stretched on, reportedly bleeding into a nationally televised NBA game before a final agreement was reached. He got somewhere just below his original ask, plus a percentage of back-end profits. It was, at the time, the highest salary ever paid to a single actor in the history of American television. What Warner Brothers chose not to acknowledge publicly was the full context surrounding that deal. Just months earlier, on Christmas Day in 2009, Sheen had been arrested for attacking his wife, Brooke Mueller, at their Aspen home. The incident resulted in criminal charges. He entered rehab. The studio and network waited. They had no choice. The show simply could not function without him. And everyone in the room knew it. What no one said out loud was that by paying him $2 million per episode in the aftermath of a domestic violence arrest, they were signaling something very specific. That his behavior, whatever it was, would be tolerated as long as the ratings held. That signal would prove to be catastrophic. The cracks had been visible long before they became headlines. During Season 7, Sheen showed up to a taping so intoxicated that he could not stand without bracing himself against the furniture. He forgot entire sections of dialogue. The writing team had to improvise on the spot, redistributing his lines to other cast members while the studio audience sat waiting. There were arguments with Chuck Lorre, the show's creator, that went beyond creative disagreement. Sheen would tear apart scripts in front of the cast and crew, demanding rewrites, dismissing the work of writers who had dedicated years to building his character into something audiences cared about. Behind closed doors, the relationship between Sheen and Lorre had deteriorated into something that no longer resembled professional collaboration. It had become a standoff between a creator who understood the machinery of the show and a performer who had come to believe that he was the machine. In October 2010, Sheen trashed a hotel room at the Plaza in New York City while intoxicated. The damage cost $7,000 to repair. He entered rehab again. And again, the studio waited. By January 2011, CBS and Warner Brothers made the decision to halt production of 2.5 Men entirely, ostensibly, so that Sheen could seek treatment. It was framed as a compassionate pause, a network looking out for one of its most valuable assets. What it actually was, though almost no one said this at the time, was an institution trying to reassert control over a situation that had slipped far beyond its ability to manage. Sheen's response was not to seek treatment. His response was to throw a party. The gathering lasted 36 hours. By the accounts that later emerged, it involved significant quantities of drugs, a rotating cast of participants, and an almost complete detachment from the reality that his career and the livelihoods of approximately 200 crew members was hanging in genuine jeopardy. He ended up in the hospital, and from the hospital, he told anyone who would listen that he was completely fine, that he had, in his words, closed his eyes and made it so. That phrase, so casual, so disconnected from anything resembling self-awareness, was the first public signal of how far things had actually gone. What came next was unlike anything American entertainment had seen before. Sheen began making the rounds of radio programs and television interviews with a frequency and intensity that felt less like publicity and more like something else entirely. He described his drug intake in terms that made the hosts visibly uncomfortable. He spoke about his own physiology as though he were a different species than ordinary humans. He invoked tiger blood. He claimed Adonis DNA. He called himself a warlock, a rock star from Mars, a different breed of person operating on a frequency that lesser minds simply could not access. And people could not stop watching. There is something in the spectacle that activated the same part of the brain that makes people slow down to look at car accidents, an awful, guilty fascination with watching something fall apart at great speed. In the first 24 hours after he joined Twitter on March 1, 2011, he accumulated 1 million followers. The platform had never seen that growth rate before. Catchphrases emerged from his interviews, winning, Tiger Blood, the goddesses, and spread through popular culture with the velocity of things that are both genuinely strange and infinitely quotable. Chuck Lorre responded the way creators often respond when they have lost control of something they built. He watched, and he calculated, and he waited. The formal break came on March 7, 2011. Warner Brothers fired Charlie Sheen from 2.5 Men. The announcement was accompanied by an 11-page letter, an unusual choice, the length alone suggesting that the studio wanted the record to be very clear, documenting the specific behaviors that had made continued employment impossible. It cited his conduct toward Lorre. It cited evidence of substance abuse. It raised the possibility that he had broken the law by sharing drugs with others. It described him as a man who appeared to be in danger of harming himself, and who had consistently refused the help that had been extended to him. Sheen was earning $1.8 million per episode at the time of his termination. He was, by every available measure, the most commercially valuable performer on American network television. And the studio fired him anyway. In the history of the entertainment industry, studios almost never choose principle over profit. The calculus almost always runs in the other direction. The behavior gets tolerated, the behavior gets managed, the behavior gets hidden, and the revenue continues to flow. What Warner Brothers did in March 2011 was genuinely unusual. Whether it was driven by principle or by the calculation that the reputational damage had become too expensive to absorb is a question that probably has no clean answer. But the result was the same. The highest paid actor on television was out of a job, and 200 people who had nothing to do with any of it were suddenly uncertain about theirs. 3 days after the firing, Sheen sued Warner Brothers and Chuck Lorre for $100 million. The suit claimed wrongful termination and alleged that Lorre had used his influence to engineer Sheen's removal in retaliation for personal conflicts rather than legitimate professional concerns. The legal maneuvering that followed, arguments over jurisdiction, arbitration clauses, the question of where the dispute would ultimately be resolved, played out over the following months before reaching a private settlement in September 2011, the terms of which were never disclosed. Estimates suggested Sheen may have received upward of $125 million in total, including back pay and a share of rerun profits that would accumulate over time. The money was significant. What it could not buy back was the show he had left behind. CBS needed a replacement, and they needed one fast. The network's upfront presentations to advertisers, the annual ritual where television networks pitch their upcoming schedules to the buyers who will fund them, were weeks away. Walking into those rooms with an empty slot where their highest-rated comedy had been sitting was not an option. Hugh Grant was approached. Negotiations reportedly reached an advanced stage, with an offer of $1 million per episode on the table. Then, on May 10th, Grant walked away, citing creative disagreements. The timing was disastrous. 2 days later, Ashton Kutcher's name appeared. The deal moved with unusual speed, and on May 13th, just in time for the network's advertiser presentations, CBS announced that Kutcher would join the cast as a new character named Walden Schmidt, a tech billionaire whose arrival at the beach house would be preceded by the funeral of Charlie Harper, killed off-screen by a train in Paris. The announcement was greeted with skepticism in some quarters. Kutcher's fan base skewed younger than the show's existing audience. His comedic range had not been extensively tested in the long-form, multi-camera format that Two and a Half Men relied upon. But Chuck Lorre backed the choice publicly and without reservation, and the gamble paid off in ways no one had quite predicted. When the Season 9 premiere aired on September 19, 2011, 28 million people watched. That was double the show's normal ratings. They came to see how the show would explain what had happened to Charlie Harper. And what they got was a funeral attended by a parade of his ex-girlfriends, each with a different version of the same story, followed by the reveal that he had been struck by a train in Paris while apparently sober and in a relationship, which was treated as the greatest cosmic joke in the history of the character. It was the right ending for the wrong reasons. It was funny, and it was ugly, and it was honest in a way the show had never quite been before about what Charlie Harper actually was, not a lovable rogue, but a bottomless pit of need dressed up in bowling shirts and clever one-liners. Walden Schmidt was the opposite, rich in the same way Harper had been rich, but emotionally raw, where Harper had been armored. Kutcher played him as a man who genuinely wanted to connect with people and kept getting in his own way, which gave the writers room to do things with the character that they had never been able to do with Sheen, moments of actual vulnerability, actual growth, actual consequence that didn't get reversed by the following week's cold open. Not everything worked. Angus T. Jones, who had been playing Jake Harper since he was 10 years old, was visibly struggling with his place in a show whose identity had been rebuilt around a different dynamic. In 2012, he appeared in a video recorded by a religious organization and told viewers, directly and without apparent concern for the professional fallout, that the show was filth and that people should stop watching it. He explained that his faith had made it impossible for him to continue participating in content he found morally objectionable, and that the salary, $300,000 per episode at that point, had become a source of guilt rather than satisfaction. The reaction was intense. The entertainment industry does not respond well to ingratitude, real or perceived, and Jones absorbed a significant amount of hostility for what many people interpreted as biting the hand that had made him wealthy. He apologized the following day, clarifying that he had not meant disrespect to his colleagues, but he did not retract the substance of what he had said. By 2013, CBS had announced he would no longer be a series regular. By 2014, he was gone entirely, eventually departing for the University of Colorado Boulder to pursue studies in environmental science and Jewish studies. The show continued without him, and without the structural weight that the Jake Harper character had once provided. It continued in a somewhat diminished, but still commercially viable form until February 2015, when the series finale aired and gave Chuck Lorre the opportunity to say the last word in a conflict that had defined the most turbulent chapter of his career. The episode was titled, of course, He's Dead. The production had been surrounded by deliberate secrecy for weeks, partial scripts, blacked out pages, guest stars who received only the lines they needed and nothing else. Charlie Sheen tweeted the day before the finale that audiences should not expect to see him on the show, which only intensified speculation. The episode itself, when it aired, drew 13.5 million viewers. What they witnessed in the final minutes was this: a figure resembling Charlie Harper, glimpsed from behind, never shown clearly, walked up to the front door of the Malibu beach house and rang the bell. Before the door could open, a grand piano fell from the sky and crushed him. The piano weighed close to 1,000 pounds. A double had been used for the shot. The whole sequence lasted 15 seconds. Then the camera pulled back to reveal Chuck Lorre himself, seated in a director's chair, looking directly into the lens. He said a single word: winning, the catchphrase that had defined Sheen's public meltdown 4 years earlier. And then a second piano fell and crushed him too. The reaction divided neatly along the lines of what people had thought about the original conflict. Some found it petty. A creator using the final moments of a 12-year show to score points against a man who was no longer in a position to respond. Others found it bracingly honest, a public acknowledgement of something the industry usually keeps carefully hidden, which is that creative relationships can become genuinely hateful, and that the people inside them sometimes want very badly to have the last word. Sheen called it silly but effective. He said he was honored to have been worth a piano. That response, so different from the tiger blood rhetoric of 2011, pointed towards something that had quietly shifted in the years since the firing. In 2021, on the 10th anniversary of the meltdown, Sheen gave an interview in which he said there were 55 ways to handle that, and I picked number 56. He acknowledged that the drug use, the public theater, the $100 million lawsuit had all been symptoms of a same underlying problem. A man who had been given more money and more permission than any institution should extend to a person in active crisis, and who had used both to accelerate his own destruction. The show that fired him went on to run 4 more seasons. The show's creator used the finale to drop a piano on his memory. The 200 people who had lost 8 episodes of work in the spring of 2011 eventually got their jobs back, though the version of the show they returned to was permanently and irreversibly different. What 2.5 Men became after Charlie Sheen left was, in some ways, a more honest version of what it had always been trying to be, a show about men who didn't know what they wanted and kept reaching for the wrong things. The difference was that after 2011, the lesson was no longer theoretical. It had already happened, in real time, in front of everyone, with a camera running. The scene that took 2.5 Men off the air wasn't in any script. It played out across 6 weeks of radio interviews and Twitter posts and hospital visits and court filings. And it ended not with a laugh track, but with an 11-page letter and a check that neither side would ever publicly describe. Chuck Lorre got the last word. He usually does. But Charlie Sheen got the piano. And somehow, years later, looking back at all of it, the money, the chaos, the public theater, the wreckage, the strange twilight career that followed, it is genuinely difficult to say which of them came away with the better deal.